This is the grave of Joe Rollins, who got into a feud with W.L. Carter that would eventually result, after 2 decades, in the deaths of 2 of Carter's sons, and the death sentences of 3 of Rollins' sons. Now, I don't want to tell you how this story ends immediately, but you need to understand that both men were preachers, and it seems to be that they had differences of opinion, because Rollins was a Baptist and Carter was a Methodist. Every time Rollins would move, it seemed like the Carter family would move to accompany them, and what made things worse was that W.L. Carter seemed to go out of his way to irritate and annoy and enrage Rollins because he thought it was kind of funny. The guy would freak out and go into a rage every time he was poked, and Carter just thought it was good fun. But this would eventually escalate into a murderous family feud. From the outset of the feud, the Rollins and Carter families both lived in Coffee County, and as tensions heated up between them, they both decided to go their separate ways, with the Rollins family moving 12 miles north of Valdosta and the Carter family moving somewhere in Florida. After a few years, Joe Rollins had been bumping shoulders with businessmen and lawyers and making a name for himself as a Baptist preacher in the community, and that is when the Carter family returned. And this whole time, it seems like the Rollins family is getting let off the hook in legal battles pretty often, because as I mentioned, Joe Rollins had a bit of a hot temper and he was constantly getting into fights, and it seemed like every time he got into a fight, his friend, the judge, would let him off pretty easy. And when the Carter family moved in, eventually the local community began to see that he would drag Carter in, and he would take him to court every time and he would always win. And eventually public opinion turned against the Rollins family, and as soon as that happened, Joe Rollins decided to kill his former friend, the Methodist preacher W.L. Carter. The actual murders in Valdosta began, as they often do in the Deep South, with a property dispute, although it seems this property dispute was caused intentionally by Joe Rollins. That's because he went out of his way to hire a turpentine company to come cut trees down on his property, and he said, by the way, the property line extends a couple hundred feet into Carter's property. He lied to them. Well, when Carter woke up and saw that these men were chopping trees down on his land, he was incensed and took it to court, and neither the Rollins or the Carter families were satisfied with the results. They brought out elderly people to tell where the old fences used to be, they put up new fences, and the town started realizing that it seemed like Rollins was always getting a better deal, but he was never satisfied, and they started looking down on him. They didn't respect him as much as they used to, and that's the moment that Rollins decided not only to kill W.L. Carter, but to wipe his entire family out. And because Rollins at that time was sick and couldn't really move around that well, he would use the help of his young sons, 3 of them, who would go over to the farm with the help of a black man that he conscripted essentially for help, and kill the Carter's children, and then burn the house down. And this is the Pine Grove Baptist Church Cemetery in Nashville, Barren County. If we pan over here, you can see the Carter family is buried right here, with W.L. Carter on the left, his wife Ella buried next to his son James Carter, and another son, Lee Newsom Carter. His 3rd son, who survived the raid of 1905, Walter Carter, is buried elsewhere in this cemetery. And this is the grave of William Lewis, or W.L. Carter. Now, by this point in the story, Joe Rollins already had a mind to kill the whole Carter family, but began his plot with animal abuse. And this animal abuse seems to be very surreal, almost like a fever dream. Rollins killed one of the Carter's hogs who got close to his barn and then lit a bundle of sticks before tossing it on the back of one of Carter's mules and smacking it on the rear, sending it running towards the Carter house. He was hoping to burn the building down with all of the evidence, but thankfully he didn't succeed. Joe's sons then caught young Willie Carter bathing in a stream on their property and nearly drowned him, but he managed to escape, and W.L. Carter finally brought Joe to court. When he was at last convicted of animal cruelty and his boys of assault, he knew that he'd have to annihilate the entire Carter family sooner rather than later. Locals told the paper that the 2 were a perfect match for each other. Joe became furious all too fast, but W.L. Carter liked to drive him up a wall. He'd speak coolly to him and then turn and tell his friends that he thought it hilarious how he could wind him up so bad. Finally, in 1905, Rollins made his first direct murder attempt. He walked up to the fence line, opened the gate, and let Carter's cattle out. When he came looking, Rollins shot him. The man played dead, and Joe told his sons to go plant a gun on him while he went to town. As soon as Joe was out on the road, W.L. stood up in front of a gathering crowd and showed that Joe had ambushed him and shot him in the leg, and that he was unarmed. This was a bombshell to the community, and Rollins, because he was still friends with local men of power, was let out on a $1,200 peace bond and spent the remainder of his free time telling his neighbors he would kill Carter and nobody would ever know. At this point in Southern history, most black preachers would often moonlight as itinerant laborers, so Joe Rollins hired one of them to build a chimney on his property, and once he talked enough with him, he said, "I need a black man who can do a job for me that's a little bit illegal and who won't ask questions." Well, the preacher seems to have misunderstood him because he called on his friend Alf Moore, who was a black man who could do any number of tasks for the Rollins family. So eventually, Joe Rollins called on Alf Moore and said, "At the very day that he came to the house, you are now confined to my property. You're going to spend the night in a farm or an outbuilding on the farm. You're going to eat this food that I've brought to you in a sackcloth. And then in the middle of the night, you're going to go down to the Carter farm with my sons and then wipe out Carter's family." Well, it seems like he looped Alf Moore into this plot because, in my opinion, there's no way the Rollins family, after killing the entire rival clan, would allow a black man to go as a loose end. And the two Carter children are buried here at the Fellowship Baptist Church in this small little crossroads town of Cecil, just north of Valdosta. Buried here is 13-year-old Carrie B. Carter and her 15-year-old brother William, the two children of W.L. Carter who were killed in that feud in 1905. Now I want to go over a little bit of the backstory on how precisely they were murdered. For the plan laid out for Alf Moore, it seems pretty obvious that the Rollins family patriarch intended to kill him as well. After all, why not let him leave the property? That night, the two Rollins children and their perhaps reluctant accomplice, Alf Moore, crept up behind the Carter smokehouse. The Carters were up late eating dinner a little bit later than normal, and this is because they had a sick calf and the boys were watching after it. Eventually, they heard their small dog barking and went to investigate, thinking that their cow was acting up. At the trial, it was found that Milton Rollins had shot both of the Carter children and that Jesse fired the coup de grace into Carrie. W.L. Carter was crippled and couldn't run out into his yard to defend his children, although he wanted to desperately, so he barricaded the house. His family was very well armed, and for hours the home was under siege. It's hard to imagine the drama that unfolded as the Rollins children, and especially Alf Moore, knew that if they left any survivors, immediately the police would be notified. And eventually they tried firing the house, as they were told to by their father, but it was impossible, and the fire was too heavy, coming from the direction of the Carters' windows, and they walked back to Joe Rollins' farm after failing to set the house alight. And the rest of the Carter family lived full lives. His wife, Ella Armstrong Carter, lived to be 66 years old and passed away a few years after he did in 1929. Their son, James Carter, died in 1938, 42 years old, and is buried right here next to his brother, Lee Carter. Lee also died in May of 1944. He was 41 or 42 years old. I'm unsure of when he was born in 1902. Throughout the trial, Alf Moore provided incriminating evidence and testimony against the Rollins patriarch, Joe. He proved that he did eat in the outbuilding on the Rollins property, and they were able to trace the footsteps from the outbuilding over to the Carter farm. They were both hanged alongside each other on December 4th, 1906. They were both allowed to give a last statement, and at that statement, Joe Rollins said he'd never met Alf Moore in his life, whereas Alf Moore, who has no known grave, prayed for the mortal soul of Joe Rollins and said that all he can ask for is forgiveness. And on his tombstone it says, "This bark was well built, but misguided, run a swift on the rocks of destruction." Police almost immediately arrested Joseph Rollins and his three sons, so his wife, Angeline Rollins, traveled back up to Coffee County to the home of her very elderly father, a man named J.J. Jowers, who had lost his arm in the Battle of Gettysburg. She only brought with her a daughter, and naturally her father was distraught and just heartbroken to see that his three sons might be executed for the crime. In spite of all their heartbreak, it's very good that J.J. Jowers, her father, allowed her to live for free in their home with her only child left that wasn't in jail, Lola. Meanwhile, his wife helped watch after the two, and Angeline campaigned tirelessly for the release of her sons from prison. And this is Lola, the youngest daughter of the Rollins family. She's buried here right next to her mother, and in the shadow of the graves of her grandparents who took care of her when her father was executed and her brothers were put in jail. Jesse and Milton Rollins were both sentenced to death with no recommendation from the court for mercy. However, their third brother, Leonard Rollins, was sentenced to death with a recommendation for mercy, which means that the court could step in and cancel the execution. However, because of the tireless campaigning of their mother, who's buried right over here, the judge finally remarked that the only crime they were guilty of was blind obedience, and eventually they were let out of jail and acquitted of the crime because they were so young at the time of the murders. At the trial, the courtroom heard that young Milton Rollins had shot both of Carter's children, and when they saw young Carrie struggling, Jesse Rollins fired the coup de grace, which killed her. And that is why both of these men, or boys at the time, were sentenced to die with no recommendation of mercy. I just want you to imagine the relief and the bittersweet celebration when the court finally said that the Rollins boys could walk free, and they stepped out of the jail as the gallows was being constructed in front of their windows.